Today, our sermon is Ebenezer and Engage, and we are looking at Exodus chapter 1. For those of you who've been away on holiday, welcome back. We studied the book of Genesis last year, and today, or this year, we're beginning on the book of Exodus. Of course, we will have breaks in between. We have the spiritual emphasis campaign coming in next month and so on and so forth, but basically, we'll be going through the book of Exodus. And so if, in case you're able to stand, we want to read through the book of Exodus. We'll read the whole of chapter 1. If you cannot stand for long, please remain seated because it's 22 verses. And I request all of us to stand up so that we can read together. Those of you who can stand, rather, so that we can read together. Those of you who are following us online, I'll also request you to just open your Bible so that we can follow together. Is it up on the screen? Yes, it is. So Exodus chapter 1 from verse 1 all the way to 22. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt." Let's go to verse 6. "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. 'Look,' he said to his people, 'the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if what breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country.'" Verse 11. "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Rameses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, 'When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live.' The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, 'Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?' Verse 19. The midwives answered Pharaoh, 'Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive.' So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: 'Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live.'" That is the word of the Lord. Please take your seats. For those who take sermon notes, I have a sermon outline. And the first note on that sermon line is Ebenezer. And then the second one is Israel in Egypt. And then a call to engage. And so the first 7 verses is what I call Ebenezer. It is a reflection. The author connects the book of Exodus to the book of Genesis. Of course, if you've not read the book of Genesis, then you won't understand these names. Who are these people? But if you've read the book of Genesis, then you are able to understand who these people are. So the first 5 books are written by one author. The author is Moses. It is one unit, 5 books. And so that is exactly what the author does for us. It is a continuation of the books of the beginning, a relation to the history, an Ebenezer moment, remembering the history of their people. From a mere 70 people to hundreds of thousands of people that they had now become. It's a moment of reflection and a moment of gratitude. A little like Karura Community Chapel. You're thinking about the 7th of January 1996 and about 30 young people, some of them you saw them last week who are here. They came together and God sent them to this particular area. And you can look at it, look back and see the things that God has done. They worked hard. Several others joined them, and you saw all of them who stood up. They worked hard. They bought this plot over here where we have the church where we can meet. And you can imagine probably if they had not done that, these 11 children going to college and the 2 also who will succeed in God's way would probably not have been supported by whether you give 2 shillings, whether you give 100 shillings, whether you give 1,000 shillings, whether you give 100,000 shillings to support these children. And so it is a moment of gratitude to these people because we stand on the shoulders of giants. And you see, this is what the author is bringing to us. If you fail to pause in your life and look at your history and look at in the past the people that God has used, the people that God has brought into your lives, the things that God has done in the past, and say, Ebenezer, this far God has brought us. Then what happened is you tend to have difficulties even seeing God at work now, or even going forward. You are unable to see God. And especially if you're facing a difficult period, when you fail to look back, when you fail to reflect, then, when difficult times come, you don't have a context in which to trust that same God who has walked with you, who has built the people that have helped you over the generation. And so Ebenezer moment also reminds us about not just what God has done, but you realize there are patterns in your history that come about. And those patterns sometimes help you. And so as he connects Genesis to Exodus, he looks at Genesis, and in Genesis you see patterns of how God works and how things work and how life works. And those patterns are in 4 sessions. You'll see there is the creation, and then from chapter 1 of creation and chapter 2, you'll see there's a reversal of creation. Some people call it decreation. And then after that, God promises a mediator, or the seed of the woman, who will change that and reverse that reversal of creation back to restoration for recreation. And then after that, there is recreation. And so this pattern just continues throughout the book of Genesis. You'll see it over and over again. And so when the author of Exodus starts to write, he brings this pattern again. He reminds us of how God created almost afresh a people who would have been destroyed by famine. He creates them again. He starts almost afresh. They had never been into Egypt before. And there they are, just the same way God created from nothing and started everything from a sense of formlessness, from a sense of emptiness, from a sense of darkness and chaos, and God created. And so you see a people being created in Egypt. A little like when Karura came to this region or this area. Those days there were very few churches around here. Ruaka was a very small little town, and there was a lot of insecurity in those days. And a lot of these areas, including Roslyn, many of them were farms. But a lot has happened. Just as a result, it's almost like creation. I was just thinking about our 30th anniversary a few days ago. I thought about 2 years ago, a young man who gave his life to the Lord in this church. And 2 years ago, he called me. He had disappeared for some time, and then he called me back, and he assured me how he's growing in the Lord. And I thought, if God had not brought this community to this place, this young man would not have been created in the sense of having a new life and knowing Jesus Christ. And so the author brings up the whole concept of creation again, bringing back how Jacob went into Israel, how he went with his sons, and how God just brought them into that place. And then also he reminds us of the issues of reversal of creation. Because you see, the reason he reminds us of that history is not just so much for Jacob, but it's beyond Jacob. It's because of the promise that God had made after creation and the reversal of creation by Adam and Eve as they sinned. The promise that God made to both Satan and to Adam and Eve. He said, I'll bring the seed of the woman, or the mediator, who will reverse this reversal of creation to recreate again. And then he says, I'll put an enmity between you and the offspring of the woman. And it is this pattern that we begin to see. Because immediately God said that, probably Satan, he's not all-knowing, he thought, maybe this seed or this person who will be born was Cain. And so he misled Cain. Then he found out it's not Cain. Then he thought it's Abel. He killed Abel. But then Seth came. 10 generations after Seth, we see another process of Satan working to ensure that this seed of the woman does not come, because this seed of the woman will crush his head, and so he does not want this seed to come. And so he seeks to pollute the human race through the Nephilims, so that there is no perfect human race. And the whole world is corrupt, but God still has a remnant, a type of a mediator called Noah. And so when the whole world is destroyed with a flood, that is a reversal of creation. Now, so those of you who remember the story of the creation, and I'll take us back into that at some point. You remember when God was creating, and in ancient history, the water was always associated with chaos. It was formless, it was empty, there was darkness over the deep, and then the Spirit of the Lord was hovering over the waters. In other words, there was water everywhere, so there could be no life. And so God separated the water and made the sky and the earth, and then he went further and separated the water from the land, so that what was considered chaos and even death began now to have life. So the seas began to have life, the land began to have life. Now, during the reversal of creation, when men began to sin, because sin is a reversal of creation, the waters come back again. And that is what the flood is about, a reversal of creation. Now, you'll see a lot of water issues in the book of Exodus. You'll see where Moses' first miracle, it is about water. That which brings life now, again, brings death. You'll see the crossing of the sea again. There'll be the water coming again together because of the reversal of creation. And so in this story, the reversal of creation is this story where Satan is trying to block the seed of the woman from ever coming. And so after Noah is rescued and becomes the mediator from the flood, he becomes a mediator, a connection between the former generation and our generation. But then later on, his generation, Abraham is called out. And when Abraham is called out, this same enmity and these same attacks on Abraham, so that this seed does not come, continues. One is his wife is barren, and they are old and they cannot get children. But two, there is a famine that comes. And this Abraham, he's a man who looks after cattle, that is his economy. He looks after animals, that is his economy. And you destroy that, and you destroy the man, and he'll be dead. And he goes to Egypt. Somehow, through all that, God provides him a son. And God promises that he will have multitudes like stars and the sand on the sea. And he gets a son, Isaac. Isaac goes through the same situation. His wife is barren. This seed cannot come. And then there is famine again to destroy him completely. Mess up his economy, mess up his life, and just bring about death. And now Jacob, in his time, there is famine. And this famine again is aimed at the seed of the woman. And how do I know that it is aimed at the seed of the woman? It is Joseph who, after the Israelites had gone into Egypt and his own father had died, now his brothers go to him. And they are really worried. What will he do? Will he kill us? And then now Joseph reveals the truth to them. He tells them, what you did, you meant it for evil. But God had brought me here in advance so that I will save you and save the seed. And then he tells them that when I die, take my bones back to Canaan, where God had promised Abraham the land. In other words, many years even before this famine, God had already preserved Joseph to go into Egypt to be a mediator, so that the seed of the woman, the mediator himself, the one ultimate mediator, will not be destroyed. And so the line of Judah is protected during this time. And so it is a very diabolical, very satanic famine. In fact, when they went into Egypt, Joseph told them, that famine has only been there for 2 years. There are 5 more years to go. That means they would not have survived if God had not sent Joseph in advance. And so the first 7 verses reenacts the history to show us how God has been preserving his people. And if the Israelites are going to be in Egypt and the trouble they are going to go through, they are to understand that there is a pattern of war that has been going on. And this pattern of war is meant to destroy the seed of the woman, or the ultimate mediator who will rescue man from the reversal of creation. You know, it's very easy for you and I, when we are reading the Old Testament, to think this is just history and to get very disconnected from it. But I want to bring to your attention that if you have Christ in your life, or if you have the potential of receiving Christ in your life, you are a bearer of the seed of the woman that destroys the works of the evil one and brings about recreation. And so the author to the book of Exodus in verse 7 brings about recreation again, the story of the recreation. Yes, he says this in verse 7, after he's given us all this. He says, now Joseph and all his brothers and generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, if you remember in Genesis chapter 1, as part of creation, this is one of the things God told people. He said, multiply and increase and fill the land. And so here they are, the promise that God had given to their great-great-grandfather Abraham is being fulfilled. Where they had just come from a mere 70 people. And now they have multiplied, greatly increased in numbers, and they have become numerous. What is the lesson of the first 7 verses? What is the lesson of the Ebenezer? The lesson is this. Through the passing of time, God's people will receive the fulfillment of his promises. And God's promises are not dependent on Abraham. They're not dependent on Isaac. They're not dependent on Jacob or any of the 12 patriarchs that are mentioned. Because it is said that now Joseph and all his brothers and that generation died. And yet, God is still keeping his promise to Abraham. And also to Adam and to Eve. Which he gave, of course, in Genesis chapter 3 and also Genesis chapter 15. Saying, I'll multiply you and make you as the stars in the sky and sand on the seashore. These men are dead. They are gone. And here is God still working. Who is holding God accountable? You see, God does not need anyone to hold him to account because he keeps his promises. He is going to fulfill it. If God says something, you and I can trust him because he will fulfill it. And I think that is why Joshua in chapter 21 verse 45, he says God has fulfilled every promise, every good promise that he's made to his people. That is the nature of our God. That is the nature of Exodus. Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 will be fulfilled through all these people. It is being fulfilled through you and I. Even as we share about the seed of the woman to other people and they come to the fulfilling promise of God. Allow me to just share a little bit about creation, the progressiveness of creation, because I've been talking about it and this is the battle that is taking place in this book. Now, when you look at the progressiveness of creation, and especially as exposed in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, it comes from formlessness to form. Maybe that could be happening to your life. Things are coming from a sense of formlessness. They are now beginning to take shape. You can see it. Genesis chapter 1 talks of when at this stage when we're introduced to our creation, it's coming from emptiness to fullness. It is coming from darkness to light. In other words, there is hope. There is clarity. And then it's coming from chaos to order. Like I mentioned, water was often a sign of chaos. It's coming from that situation. God begins to separate and just form, and there's this beauty. And then it's coming from nothingness to life. The land begins to have life. The sea begins to have life, and not just have life, but have growth. These plants have seeds, and the animals are able to reproduce, and there is increase. And that's the nature of creation. And then it comes from nothingness to a loving relationship. In verse 26, God says, let us make man in our image. Someone he can relate with, where there is love, and this person has positive image because their identity is based on God. And then in creation, there is justice, because God tells man, you rule on my behalf. And because God is a just man, man is to rule with justice, and he's to give leadership to all of creation. And so justice is big in creation. And then it comes from nothingness to blessedness and provision, because the Bible says, and God blessed them after creating man. And he gave them, he told them, these plants are for you, these animals are for you. And then he gives them freedom. This is the progressiveness of creation. He gives them freedom and joy. They have the garden, they have free, they can enjoy the fruits, except for one tree. And that one tree was a sign of the order of creation. Man was to depend on God and obey God. Woman was to submit to man as man submitted to God. And then the rest of creation was to be led by man and woman. But when reversal comes, it is the creation that tells woman what to do. That is the shrewd. It says the serpent was shrewd. And that is now we go to the reversal of creation. The serpent was shrewd and then told woman to disobey God. Then the woman went and told man what to do. And so instead of man submitting to God, submits to woman, and then there is a separation. And so when there is reversal of creation, you come from form to formlessness. You come from fullness to emptiness. You come from light to darkness, from having hope to hopelessness. From having clarity to getting confused. From order to chaos. From life and growth and increase to decline. From a loving relationship to fear, to shame, and to hate. And you want to look at how Adam and Eve behaved after the fall, after they disobeyed God. They were so afraid. They were so ashamed. They went and hid. And then you begin to see injustice taking place. And God tells them that what will happen to them between the two of them. And then you begin to see lies and shrewdness and how they deal with one another and how the devil dealt with them, cheating them that you'll be like God. And then when their eyes open, they realize that promise was false. It was not real. You come from blessedness and provision to affliction, deprivation, and burdens, where even the plants get thistles. They reject them. They have to have thorns to protect themselves from all this injustice. You come from freedom to captivity and bondage. They are no longer free the way they thought they would be free. And you come from eternal life to death. And so that is the progress that you begin to see when now the Israelites enter into Egypt. Before you begin to think that the Israelites were very good people and God, and a lot of liberal theologians try to use that. They think, the Israelites were just such nice people, and so whatever they do was right, and so on and so forth, or they were the underdogs. You will realize that from history, the Israelites were really not good people. They were just sinners. Think of the people who are mentioned. Think of Jacob. Jacob was a deceiver. Think of the son that was mentioned, the firstborn, Reuben. Reuben went to his father's bed and slept with his wife. That's incest. Think of the other children who were mentioned, Simeon and his brother Levi, how they did to the Shechemites. They deceived them and killed them, not in a time of war. That is murder, so to speak. Think of Judah and Tamar. These are people who, he was involved in adultery. Basically, you remember that story of Judah and Tamar. So the Israelites are not here because this is not a story to say the Israelites are good and God is going to save them. In fact, when Joseph went to Egypt and he became powerful, and when the Israelites came, we are actually not told how the Israelites got the land of Goshen. Because during a time of famine, you would expect that the land of Goshen would have people. How did they get those people out? Unless the land of Goshen was reserved for the king, and the king decided to give it to them. But many people believe that, and quite a good number of commentators believe, that there were wars around this area of Egypt, and that at the time of Joseph, it was not the native Egyptians who were leading Egypt. And the Egyptians had problems with Israelites because the Israelites were shepherds and they did not like them. But when Joseph sent his brothers to the king, and when he sent his fathers to the king, he tutored them what to say. And this particular king was in position. He said, look for your brothers who are good shepherds, and let them also take care of my sheep. And so those who say that this man was not an Egyptian, they had conquered the native Egyptians, they used some of those to say these were not really foreigners. And of course, they'll argue, if you doubt that a foreigner can be a pharaoh in Egypt, as Josephus, the first century historian, says, Moses himself was going to be a pharaoh. He was next on line. So it is possible that the pharaoh who was in place during the time of Joseph was not a native of Egypt. This is something then that Joseph did. Joseph, after the famine came, the Egyptians bought food. They ran out of money. And then he said, what now you will do, you will have to give me your land. And he gave it to the Pharaoh. So the land in Egypt belonged to the Pharaoh, and they had to pay taxes to the Pharaoh even after the famine. But the people in Goshen, because their land was productive and they did not have to come to buy food, they did not have to pay that tax. And so they continued to prosper. And they were in one particular location. The same thing happened to the priests. The priests were not paying the tax. In other words, if you have the church in your pocket, and then you have these people in your pocket, ask, if you're a Kenyan, you understand our history, the colonialists, the British, which part of the land did they take? The best part, isn't it?
And those who came after independence took those parts. What you do is you isolate yourself. And then you begin to stand out. So the native Egyptian was being killed by these Turks even after famine. That is called injustice. So if you're MP, I thank God I have a good relationship with my MP and I get to talk to her about a few things. But if you're a member of parliament or your MCA begins to develop your area, particular area, unjustly at the expense of other people, if they're hardworking and they're developing that place, well and good. But if you sense they are using their political power to favor you, take time to talk to them. Because your regime will come to an end. And so by the time we go to verse 8, what is happening here is the native Egyptian are now back to power. And it's not that they did not know Joseph, because Egyptians are the best in keeping history. They did not care about him because they felt he had participated in their oppression. And so verse 8 is almost like now a creation. God gives them a chance, the native Egyptians, to lead. They're back. But then, because they had been oppressed, they are in fear that we might ever go back again to being oppressed by foreign powers. And so they begin to deal shrewdly. Now, that word shrewd reminds you of reversal of creation. And so they deal with the Israelites worse than the Israelites and the former foreigners had dealt with them. And these are possibilities. It's not really like written in white and black, but this is from history and so on and so forth. And they become mean. And so from verse 8 it says, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. And then he said, look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal with them shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave this country. It starts a process of reversal of creation, where instead of progressive growth for all the people, the Egyptians now begin to oppress the Israelites. So it says they put slave masters over them to oppress them. In other words, to force them to work for them, to use their labor. And then one of the things that they do is they have them to build Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. Why is that so? Because you remember it was the storehouses that Joseph had built that were used to have these native Egyptians taxed even on their own land. You remember the heart tax and the land tax. And so the first thing they do is to make sure they have food. But it says the more they oppress them, the more they multiplied and spread. And so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the field. And all the harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. You remember during the Holy Communion or the Passover, the Israelites had to eat bitter herbs to remind them constantly that your life was bitter. It was a bitter time, a reversal of creation. And then now we come to the mediators from verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. These two women became the mediators, the type, the illustration of a mediator. They stood in between death of the Israelites and protected the Israelites from being killed. And then because of these mediators, there's recreation. The people multiplied. They continue to grow. Of course, the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered the Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Because they had obeyed God, God was increasing the people. He decided, even you'll be part of that increase. And so they increased. The whole recreation took place. And then Pharaoh gave these orders to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born to you must throw in the Nile, but let every girl live. What is the lesson of the Israelites being in Egypt? It is that through experience of suffering, God's people will multiply and spread abroad. You see it also in the book of Acts. When there is persecution, when there is oppression, when it breaks out in Jerusalem, the disciples split out and they spread out, and the word of God multiplies, and the believers are built up. And that is why, as believers, we must, if we look at this pattern, we must not be afraid, because we are the carriers of the seed of the woman. We will definitely be in the crosshairs of Satan, and he will seek to distract us. He will seek to oppress us. But we should not be afraid, because through the experience of suffering, God's people multiply and spread abroad, and they don't sit pretty. Finally, there is this call to engage. You see, through the pressures of godless culture, God's people will be defined by obedient courage, like Shiphrah and Paul. In John chapter 16, verse 33, it says, in this world you'll have trouble. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, it says, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who can destroy both the body and the soul. You see, when Pharaoh resisted God, what came upon Egypt was the creation, as we'll see later. Because Egypt's sin unleashed the forces of chaos. And there is individual and collective responsibility here. And there's individual and collective engagements we are called to here. One of the things they did is the Pharaoh said, let's oppress these people. Let's afflict them with heavy burdens. One, the people would have said no. And they would have said, you do it, but we will not do it. But they went ahead and they participated in small little ways. And because they stole labor, we are told that when the Israelites were leaving Egypt, all that stolen labor they had to pay. Each family had to pay. The Israelites simply went to them and said, give us what you have. They gave them all the precious gold they had, all the savings they had put wherever. And the Bible says Egypt was plundered. They paid it back. In other words, when you engage in reversal of creation, thinking you're going forward, you will meet with the justice of God. And this is both at an individual level and a collective level. And this happens to our lives in various ways. Pua and Shiphrah, they refused to participate in this reversal of creation. They feared God. And they said we were not going to kill the boys. They said we were not going to participate in that which is not right, which God does not approve. How do you and I engage both at an individual level and at a collective level? As we celebrate 30 years and as we look at the book of Exodus, I think it is time for us collectively to say, wherever you work, you will not steal. And if you have children and they bring home a pencil that is not theirs, you will tell them, could you take it back? What shall we not steal? We'll say we'll not steal our employer's time. We'll not steal from our businesses or from other people's businesses. We'll not take that which is not ours or that which has not been legally given to us. But also at an individual level. Because that becomes a reversal of creation, which at the end becomes counterproductive. Whether it is this generation that paid for it or their children paid for it, someone pays for it. they went further and enslaved the Israelites. This was the plan of the king. The people didn't protest. They went with it. They participated. When the Israelites left Egypt, the Egyptians realized that it was they, the Egyptians, who were actually slaves to the Israelites, because they could not live without them. And that is why they pursued them. And that is why if you ever think that you will exploit someone, you may actually be doing yourself a disservice. You may be enslaving yourself while you think you're enslaving someone else. They were held captive. Their children could not wash clothes. Their children could not cook. Their wives and husbands didn't even know what happens in the kitchen. They were starving. The only way was to go and pursue the Israelites, and they died. It led to death. Reversal of creation never benefits anyone. They were told by Pharaoh, let's drown the boys in the Nile. They started doing it. But they were drowned in the Red Sea. The Israelites, yes, could pass. They were drowned in the Red Sea. There was individual responsibility and there was collective responsibility. And I have friends even here and even in our campuses who are in some of our forces. Some of them are in our military forces, some in the police forces. And I talk to them. And I tell them the fact that the government may tell you to shoot people when they are demonstrating, be very careful. Because you'll be held individually responsible. You will drown in the Red Sea. You will not pass. You'll be held responsible at an individual level. Even though you may say, I've been told by a higher authority, you have an individual authority, an individual responsibility. And some of us here may be getting into situations where we say, I've been told by somebody else, or someone else is pushing me. You'll be held responsible. And we are called to engage in creation as opposed to reversal of creation. All the mediators who are presented to us in this chapter, they have their own faults. I've talked to you about the faults of Joseph. I've talked to you about the faults of Puah and Shifra. They told a bit of a lie here and there. I'm not sure it was a lie. Some people would like them not to say they were not telling lies, because the Egyptians were slaves. They used to work hard. Pain was not hard for them, so they would actually give birth quickly. But I think he's just looking for an excuse. The reality is these mediators, there's no mediator, be it Noah. He's drank himself silly. There's no mediator who is perfect. Why? Because the perfect mediator is Jesus Christ, the seed of the woman. And when he comes and mediates on our behalf and restores us to God and begins to recreate us, and that is why we begin to multiply irrespective of the situation that we face as God's people. He calls us and says, go and make disciples of all nations. In other words, we are called to engage. So it is not just Ebenezer, this fast God brought us. He says, now go. You are the bearers of the seed of the woman. Imani, could you join me so that we close? And so you're not just somebody who just sits there. And that is why for this year, our theme is engage. Why? Because you have the words of life. You have the source of life. You have been recreated. Because Christ has been decreated so that you and I may be recreated, that we may bring recreation in the rest of the world. And that comes through making disciples, through engaging. Wherever you are called, wherever you have a place of influence, and even in this church. In fact, next Sunday, I'll be commissioning a team that has been working on ways to help you if you want to engage in church in various places, in various ministries, so that you can be part of what God is doing. But you're not useless. But you're marked by heaven, but you're also marked by hell, because you bear the seed of the woman. Pastor Mani, please welcome and close for us.